This tank chat's going to be about this vehicle, the AMX-13 light tank, a French tank that started its design process just after World War II, a vehicle that's still in service to this day. Over 7,700 of these vehicles have been built. Just under half of those have been exported around the world. So a very important vehicle of the post-war era.
This video has been made possible by our supporters on Patreon, our YouTube members, and our super thanks donors. Please join them if you can, and support the Tank Museum. And thanks for watching.
Now, back to World War II. France, the Free French forces, are mainly equipped, the armoured forces, by the Americans in the later stages of World War II. De Gaulle, as the French leader, he's very keen that French military industries get started again as soon as possible because obviously France has been occupied. Some of the design work, some of the planning even begins before the end of the occupation. But de Gaulle is really, what he's trying to do is he's trying to make sure France is in a good position in that post-war world, because France was an empire, it had colonies, it wanted to get back to that status after the Second World War, and it knew there was going to be problems there. So it starts planning processes for a series of aeroplanes, vehicles that France is going to produce, but it knows at the same time, really importantly, it also knows that America is going to be a key ally, because France for some considerable time is going to have to use American equipment, and America, being now the world's probably first superpower, is going to have to help finance not just France but the rest of Europe get off its feet and get going again in the post-war world. Now initially America is worried about its kit being used to help Britain and France actually re-establish their colonial empires. They're not too sure about this, but that tends to go out the window as the fear of communism increases. And you end up with, in 1948, the Americans start something called, or they pass, the Mutual Defensive Aid Act. And that basically means large sums of money are going to be available to allied nations to help reform their forces. And America's seeing this as not just a good thing to do, but a thing to do because of that fear of communism. And France can help be a bastion against that. You've also, of course, got the Marshall Aid Plan, which is helping to rebuild Europe on the civilian side as well. So America is a very important stakeholder in the French post-war economy, but also in the building of the French military again after the Second World War. Now, France before, in the 1930s, it's got a DEFA, an agency which basically helps plan the way the French military and industry are going to interact and what's going to be required, and have we got a sort of overall strategic plan and structure for actually making equipment. Now, one of those key players who's part of this is a French general called General Demetz, and he's put in charge of what is going to be the light tank program that France is, at the moment it's using American Chaffee tanks. What's going to be the French light tank of that post-war era? And General Demetz argues quite coherently that, look, France won't be able to maintain garrisons in all its colonies around the world and its places, spheres of interest. So it's not going to be able to have that many troops available to be able to do that. So why not make sure we have a strong paratrooper force, and that paratrooper force can be flown to where the issue is, or flown to support that individual militia or whatever it happens to be in that relevant colony. And they may encounter enemy tanks, in which case we're going to need a light tank that's air portable. And he pushes for the idea of a 12-ton light air portable vehicle. Now that idea is argued around within the French, and a key player as a designer of this, who pre-World War II, he worked for AMX, he goes to America and studies in America during the Second World War, and he becomes a key designer of what this vehicle is going to be, this light tank is going to be. His name is Joseph Molyneux, and he pushes forward as well the idea we're going to need a powerful gun and keep that weight down for the air portability, and he ends up working, overseeing what the company that AMX, which is ultimately going to build this vehicle. Now, they argue the case that they want a 75mm gun. They go to a number of French companies. 3 actually put forward proposals for this vehicle. FCM is one of those companies. They're basically saying, what's the hull going to be that's going to carry that 75mm gun? FCM, one of the French companies, comes up with a quite complex hydro-pneumatic system. AMX, the French company that Molyneux had worked for before the Second World War, their offer has a quite simple shell, but quite radical in some of its design process. They are looking at putting an engine in the front of the vehicle. They know that this 75mm gun is likely to be a long gun. We'll look at that in a moment. So let's have the turret at the back, because you don't want a massive overhang of your gun and the problems that can sometimes cause. And they go as well for torsion bar suspension, 5 road wheels on either side, torsion bar suspension. That is the chassis that is chosen by the French authorities, and that leads forward to become what we now know as the AMX-13 tank. 1949, they start the process to build some 5 prototypes that started to be put together, and they immediately start encountering some of the problems that's going to bedevil this story, which is you have an aspiration, the post-war world comes into play, and it knocks some of those aspirations off course. What you've got there is, first of all, so they wanted this vehicle to be air portable. Part of their planning was there was going to be a plane that could take that vehicle around the world. Actually, the budgets aren't there to create an air portable or a plane that's big enough to be able to take the 12 and then the 13-ton AMX tank around the world. So very quickly, this early aspiration for the air portability that goes into its 12-ton makeup is dropped. And very quickly, we're up to, by 49, it's now being called the AMX-13. The tonnage has gone up from AMX-12, so 13 tons. So the design process, what are they going to come up with? Well, for the hull, they end up with a Mathis water-cooled petrol engine, about 250 horsepower, 8-cylinder, and that means you'll get about 37 miles out of a 13-ton vehicle at its top speed. So quite a speedy vehicle for that sort of early era that we've got there, and that'll give it about 250-mile range. They're going to put that on the side, at the front of the vehicle, transmission across the front, and have the driver sit next to, at the front of the vehicle, sit next to that engine. So as I mentioned, the fact that this gun that they want to put on it is going to be a long 75mm gun, turret is going to go at the rear. That 75mm gun, the CN 7550 gun, it's been developed, and this is where we have to be careful with our language, because we often say it's developed from the KWK-42L70, the gun that was on the Panther. Actually, people get upset about that if you're saying it that way. It's inspired by, you might be. They're looking for the same outcomes as the gun on the Panther, might be a better way of saying it. They're not actually using the same barrel, the breech, etc. This is all really a new French design, but they want to match it to the lethality that was there on that Panther gun from World War II. So this gun that's come up with, a CN 7550 gun, it will fire an armor-piercing round at about 1,000 meters a second. That will penetrate 175 millimeters of armor plate. So it's a powerful gun, but it's also that long gun. They give it a muzzle brake. It can fire armor-piercing, high explosive, but you've got then the issue of how are we going to mount it? And this is one of those radical features of the AMX-13. They go to a company called 5 Lille, which is, it's basically a suburb of Lille. They're named after the company, named after that suburb. They are the ones who designed this radical new turret. Michel, the designer, he's coming up now with this idea of an oscillating turret. So we have a turret in 2 parts. The top part is the gun doesn't have its own mantlet in the traditional sense. The gun is fixed to the roof or the top part of the turret. And that means to say that if you put an autoloader on that top part, you've got no issues about trying to actually angle the gun for an autoloader to feed in the round. It's actually all on one plane together. So they build this new turret with an autoloader system at the back, a carousel system with 2 carousels of 6 rounds each. So this can fire 12 rounds through that autoloader system before it's going to need resupply or restocking the carousels. Cases are ejected out of a small port at the rear of the turret when the gun has fired. So this automation means that you've now got only 2 crew members needed in the turret. You've got the driver down the front, of course, so 3rd member, but you've got a commander and a gunner who's aiming the gun and firing that gun. You don't need a loader in a traditional sense. Rounds can individually be loaded, but in essence, the argument is you go away from the battlefront after you fired your 12 rounds. You need to actually reload the rounds from the top of the turret if you're going to feed into those carousels. 12 rounds to load again and then back into action. So their planning process is to always really have 2 AMX-13s in action together so one can cover the other should reloading be needed in a combat situation. It's fitted with a coaxial machine gun, 7.5 Mach 31. That's basically the pre-war French tank machine gun. Very reliable, very sensible choice in many ways at this early post-war period. 150 round drums of ammunition are carried as well, and there's a coaxial machine gun. Sometimes they put a mount in front of the commander's position as well, so you could mount a machine gun there. The turret is made up of a casting on the front that's about 40 millimeters thickest armor and about 15 millimeters thinnest armor on the side and rear. When you look at that, what they're saying at the time is really this is only going to be proof against small arms and shell splinters. You are not there to take rounds 20 millimeter above will probably penetrate your frontal arcs of armor on an AMX-13. End of the 40s, February 1950, the first turret is off for trials. They build 12 prototypes. And then, of course, marrying these two things together, you've in essence got now the AMX-13 as a vehicle. It is sent off to Aberdeen Proving Ground in the States, and this is part of the issue. The French have to convince the Americans that this is a project worth funding with that defensive money that they've put up. So it is shown off in 49 and 1950. The Americans, there's one point where there's 300 American and French officers all descend on Aberdeen to see the trials of this vehicle. They argue, the Americans say, yep, we like this, we want a timetable. And the Americans put pressure on the French to really keep this project going and keep a momentum behind it so it doesn't dissipate into a decade or so before something actually reaches the troops. At those trials, by the way, there are projects that the French are coming up with that the Americans refuse to fund. So, for example, the AMX-13 tank, they're not going there. They don't think that's a good idea or a sensible spend of the money. Back in France, a conglomerate is put together, 3 state arsenals, 4 private companies come together, and production begins. There are, as inevitably with projects like this, early teething troubles. The first vehicles are actually shown on a Bastille Day parade as early as 1951, but it's quite some time later before, up to 54, some people say, before they're really getting out to the French troops in numbers. And as they're producing these vehicles, the hulls, the Mathis, the original engine company, they go bankrupt, so they're taken over. Things change, as inevitably with large productions run. 4 different types and identifiable hull types. So you've got major changes. So they tend to go under letters 2A, 2B, 2C, 2D for the hulls as improvements are being made on that production run. 5 different turret configurations in essence are going on there with slight variations, whether we got rubber or canvas gaskets where the join is. So things change during the production. The French are looking at this vehicle, that air portability. They're still trying to find ways you could put it in a plane. They do experiments. They end up having to take it into 3 major component parts, taking it apart that way. So, whether you can really claim that's air portable, because it's going to take quite some time to put a tank back together again. But so they look at giving these tanks initially to the cavalry. The French go through in the 50s and 60s a series of changes with their formations. How are they going to use armour? What is going to be a division side? Who should have the armour, the lighter armour? They've tried already, early 50s, they look at using the AMX-13 as potentially a recce vehicle. Too noisy, they come back straight away. They prefer the wheeled armour for reconnaissance. So light cavalry units end up having these AMX-13s initially. But France also, just like so many other countries, they're being hit by not only the economic circumstances, but the world situation. They've been fighting in Indochina. They end up fighting as well in Algeria. That puts various projects off course and delays and changes what was originally the French design and aims for the use of this AMX-13 tank. Now, the vehicles are used, you see them in Suez. 2 squadrons go out to Suez there, alongside American M47s that the French are using. They're also used out in the Far East, but one of the problems is if you're trying to fire in counterinsurgency roles, Algeria, Far East, they were looking as well for a better high explosive charge than what was being fired by the 75mm gun. So one of these changes, and there's quite a number of projects to either upgun or change the AMX-13. One of those first projects is the idea of taking basically the Chaffee turret, giving a new turret ring on top of the AMX hull, dropping down the Chaffee turret. They ended up calling these, they converted about 150 of them, and they ended up calling them AMX US tank turret that they're putting on there. And they were, the original intention there is because basically the Chaffee has got a better high explosive charge on that 75mm gun that it's carrying. That meant the crew, of course, went up to 4 on those particular variants. They weren't in service that long. They were done particularly for this counterinsurgency role to fire a better high explosive charge. When that was over, most of these AMX US vehicles had the turrets taken back off, and many of them were then converted into turretless driver training tanks in service that way. But this project, it also looked at the end of the 1950s, they're looking at the fact that actually the world's changing out there. Can we, with that gun, 75mm, the French are saying to themselves, actually we're now in a position that fine for ambush, fine for hit and run using the AMX's good speed, 37 miles an hour and mobility, but actually if that gun won't penetrate things like the frontal armour of the T-54, 55, then we're in trouble. So upgrade programs to the firepower start relatively early on. One of those programs leads to something called the AMX-30. They're looking at a French-designed 105mm gun that they end up being able to put on what they then call the FL-12 turret. It has a double muzzle brake at the end. It's a very impressive engineering feat, but the French can't really afford to do this with the numbers of AMX-13s they've got in service at the time. So even though there's an up-gunning program there, that program ends up only being offered for export sales. And this, of course, is a vehicle we'll look at in a moment that is really, they're very keen on those export sales to help build their own industry and again, secure these markets around the world. The French, meanwhile, though, still having that problem of being able to upgun, they come to a cheaper and more practical for them solution, which is basically bore out your 75mm high velocities guns, make them medium velocity, and that gun becomes the 90mm CN90, what they call the CN90 F3 gun. Now for that, they don't need a muzzle brake on the end of the gun because again, the pressures inside are not so great. It's got less recoil, so from that point of view, it's actually quite good on a smaller vehicle that way. They add a thermal sleeve to that gun, again, because now the metal's thinner, they don't want any warping, bending, making that gun inaccurate after it's been firing a few rounds back to if you've got a cold wind blowing across it. Give it that thermal sleeve, and they end up converting about 875 of the French fleet, and that's a fleet that then, with this new gun, continues serving in French service right through into the middle of the 1980s. So it adds about 20 years to the AMX-13's life. With that as well, they add infrared sights for the gun system, infrared night driving sights for the driver as well. So these are improvements that help keep that vehicle into the French service in the front line, because by the end of the 60s, the AMX-30 is coming into service, and that, of course, is actually really, you might call a medium weight tank, but it's taking over some of the roles that the AMX-13 was needed for originally when there were larger numbers in French service. Another way of upgrading the firepower on AMX-13 is by looking at the SS-11 missile. Nord Aviation, the French are pushing the idea of wire-guided missiles. In the 1950s, they're leading the way in some of this. What you've got with the SS-11 missile system, 3,000 meters range, 660 millimeters of armor can be penetrated by that hollow charge warhead on that missile. And that basically means that that can destroy any known tank in service at this particular time. So the French authorities start looking at ways of mounting the SS-11 missile system on the turrets of AMX-13 tanks. In actual fact, it's a French officer that comes up with a very simple idea of firing these missiles from rails that are attached to the outside of the turret, and that becomes a very simple way of mounting 4 SS-11 missiles, which again, as soon as they've been fired, you've just basically got your standard AMX-13 tank underneath with its full complement of ammunition there afterwards. So with some of these AMX-13 tanks coming out of French Army service, these are available for selling on. And as I've mentioned, the sales drive behind AMX-13 has been there right from the word go. Initially, the French are looking to sell to neutral countries. We've already looked at our video, our tank chat on the Centurion tank being sold to Switzerland, the Swiss Cent. And that story goes in there where the French are coming along, really competing with Britain at the same time, saying, look, we've got this new tank, the AMX-13, it's going to be available soon. Why don't you buy into that? France, ultimately, it sells 200 AMX-13s to the Swiss, 55 when Britain's, we've got over the Korean War, Switzerland finally then goes back and buys Centurion tanks. It's a tricky era because, what was the AMX-13 up against? Well, from the Soviet side, you could argue PT-76 is being touted around the world about the same time. The Americans, the M41 Walker Bulldog, you could argue on that. Firepower on the AMX-13 is better than what's being offered by the Americans and the Soviets there. Some neutral countries, there's a market there initially for the AMX-13. And some countries, of course, when France makes a deal with Israel, it will sell weapon systems to Israel, where many other countries don't think that's right at the time. So Israel, again, is a big user, as well as India, and then this plethora of other countries end up buying, including other countries in Europe, the Netherlands, etc., end up buying quantities of AMX-13s, quite often with subtle differences, again, on their orders. So there will be differences across that AMX-13 fleet. Now, that story of the sales around the world, because of course France at this time is competing with other nations like America, but also Britain. Britain's another one of those countries that was really keen to get sales around the world post-World War II, because basically we were bankrupt in Britain at the time. So how do you make money again? And one interesting bit of paperwork I found in the archives, worth reading, because it shows a light, number one, on what was going on at the time in terms of sales and some of the issues there. But it also, dated 1968, gives some contemporary views on the AMX-13 and its pros and cons in service. But the letter originally comes from the Ministry of Defence. It's basically going out to a number of British defence attachés and interested parties saying this: we are at the moment encountering competition in many countries from French AFEs, in particular the AMX-13 and also some of the armoured cars. We are trying to get together some consolidated information on our competitors on these French vehicles and their weapons, which will enable our attachés to be properly armed to further our interests. What we are obviously looking for are adverse comments on the effectiveness, handleability and reliability of these French vehicles as compared to what we have to offer. So we kind of almost, this sort of thing is going to be going on, but it's lovely seeing this as a real item, as a letter that was being sent out. And we've got some of the responses in the file as well. And that's quite interesting because they're contemporary views of the pros and cons of the AMX-13. And one of these comes back from the British Defence Attaché actually in France, having had good relations at Saumur, etc., coming back, having spoken as well to French MX-13 crews. Good points: agility, powerful gun using heat, effective up to 1,600 meters, autonomy, roughly a battlefield day 8 to 10 hours, good silhouette with the oscillating turret, low profile vehicle, another point we haven't really mentioned, but it is a low profile vehicle. Speed, 37 miles on the road, 30 to 40 miles cross country. And then to counter that, the bad points. Crew comfort, not good. Even from the French who were serving on this, were saying it's just mediocre in terms of what it feels like being inside there. Secondary armament is inadequate, no nuclear protection, very thin armour, so vulnerable. 3-man crew makes for crew fatigue. Conventional gearbox leads to different difficulties, it's noisy and it's not robust. That's one of the reports that's talking on this. Other ones come back about crew space very restricted. Although air portable, it needs 15 very large aircraft to carry a squadron's worth. This one, we're talking 90mm, low pressure cannon, fires fin stabilised hollow charge, low muzzle velocities, accurate only up to 1,000 metre. After firing 12 rounds, the tank must retire for a crew member to dismount and reload. Ideally, the tanks have to operate in pairs to cover this. Armour thickness is mentioned again, not being particularly strong. Gun will only depress to 6 degrees over the frontal arc. AMX-13 has not been in production for 3 or 4 years. All tanks are therefore quite old, including those that have been upgunned. This comes out for some sales to, there's metal fatigue in some of the ones sold to the Dutch. And there's a series of issues that are sort of mentioned there of trying to look at how one might be able to sell your own kit better, but it also helps us understand what was thought at the time. There is an argument here saying the AMX-13 was designed for crew members of 5'7" height. Despite this, the crew space is extremely limited, so limited in fact that the French used a wheel vehicle for carrying the crew's kit. I'm not sure if that's completely true. It may have been true in one particular instance or other. But again, so there's a series there of how people were judging this vehicle. It is, whatever those criticisms, we've got to say it's a massively successful vehicle. There's so many examples of it being in combat. I can't really talk about all of them. Sometimes it comes out on tops, again, perhaps due to crew training and the tactical use there. Other times, Israelis withdrew it from service quite earlier because one of the points in these reports, if you're up against proper, inverted commas, in other words, medium weight or main battle tanks, then all of a sudden you are very vulnerable in an AMX-13 because you don't have those levels of protection. Ambush situations, fine, but in open warfare, as the Israelis found in the desert, they were very vulnerable in their AMX-13s. The AMX-13 as well, worth talking about because it leads to a whole series of variants. So the APC variant becomes the AMX VTT. We have one here in the museum. They mount a 105, then can you believe a 155 howitzer on the top of this chassis. That becomes the AMX Mark 61, 62, 63, depending on the size of the gun and the configuration there. Again, they're used by many countries around the world, and someone's estimated there are probably about 100 sort of sub-variants of the AMX-13 or derivatives that were produced over time. Only in the mid-1980s did they replace the petrol engine with a diesel. But there's still an offer because we've now still got 5 countries using the AMX, and Nexter, the French military consortium, big company, they're still offering upgrades and servicing of AMX-13 vehicles because they're still out there. So there were 26 countries using it from the early 1950s. We're now down to 5 countries using it. As I mentioned earlier, 7,700 vehicles being produced. That's a staggeringly large number for a light tank after the Second World War. It has been seen in numerous conflicts around the world. No doubt it will still appear on the battlefield again in the future in some form or another. So that's a very impressive story, a very important vehicle.